We are convening these interviews as a way to gather the knowledge, the experience, the insights of different individual well-known experts from Africa and around the world to discuss the important current agricultural issues that the continent is facing and how they are meeting these challenges with different perspectives, initiatives, and opportunities to benefit the agricultural sector in the long term. My name is Fergus McLaren. I am the Director of International Relations and Knowledge Management for the Economic Innovation Institute for Africa, and I am based in Ottawa, Canada. Our guest today, who has kindly agreed to join us, is Professor Alex Awiti, who is currently the Provost of the Aga Khan University. He was previously the Dean of the Graduate School of Media and Communications and founding director of the East African Institute at the university. Professor Awiti is a transdisciplinary scholar whose research intersects agriculture, ecology, education, society, population health policy, and the economy. As a public intellectual, he has written over 750 opinion articles published in leading Kenyan newspapers and international publications, including the International Policy Digest and The Conversation. He was also a speaker at the TEDx Nairobi 2013 and is a regular commentator on public policy issues on news networks in East Africa and international media such as CNBC, CGTN, Bloomberg News, and Al Jazeera TV. Professor Awiti is an alumnus of the CSC Leaders Program, a global leadership program for exceptional senior leaders. He also holds a PhD in ecosystems ecology. Good morning, Professor Awiti.
Good morning, Fergus. Thank you for the introduction.
Very nice to have you here, and thank you for joining us. I've been to Nairobi several times, and I enjoy traveling to Kenya whenever I have the opportunity. So I wish I was there virtually. I wish I was there to join instead of virtually, but next time. So nice to have you.
Great.
So as you know, we have 5 questions that we like to ask our individual speakers. And, just be great to get your insight and perspective on, as we mentioned before, the different agricultural issues that you've touched on, that you've worked with, that you're involved with, to get some, some really good insights from you on them. So my first question is for you. How is Africa's agricultural sector currently performing in your mind?
So thank you, Fergus, and thanks for the opportunity to have this conversation. I think Africa's agriculture is facing tremendous challenges at this point in time. I guess climate is the overarching big constraint to production with respect to rainfall, for example. But let me just say that the first thing that we need to think about is the fiscal resources that are critical to agricultural production. And the first one is land. In 1965, the per capita land holding in Africa was about 0.5 hectares per person. Today, it's about 0.2. So we're looking at a very significant decline, when at the same time, population in Africa between 1965 and the present time has increased by 375%. So that's a very serious constraint. I think the other part that is important to understand is that the UN also estimates that the proportion of land that is arable is declining. 65% of Africa's productive land is degraded, and 45% of Africa's land is arid and not accessible to rain-fed agricultural production systems. So these two things actually create serious binding constraints. One of the things that we also consider at the present time is that Africa is also just home to 6% of the world's irrigated land. Asia, for instance, accounts for 70% of the world's irrigated land. So that is the state of Africa's agriculture. And what then we see is this very, very steep yield gap, estimated about 41.3%. And, I think a lot of our viewers would know that maize yield, for instance, which maize is one of the biggest staple crops on the continent averages 1 to 2 tons per hectare against a potential of about 8 tons per hectare. So that, in a nutshell, is what the development community, FAO, and other organizations that really invested in these kinds of efforts to shore up food security on the continent are dealing with.
And as you're saying, you're seeing a large population increase. Where, if I'm not mistaken, it's Africa as a continent has the youngest population sort of cadre around the world in terms of continents. And again, that means expanding populations, of course, means expanding demand to meet the yields necessary for their sustenance. So,
yeah.
So thank you for that initial insight. So touching on some of the points that you raised, and just as a sort of a follow-up question, are there any key issues affecting the sector that you'd like to discuss, such as climate change, the Sustainable Development Goals, trade regulations, pandemic, regional and international conflicts? There are a number of these issues that are certainly, unfortunately, affecting the agriculture sector in Africa right now.
Climate change is a big one that I mentioned at the beginning, but it is not it is coming to exacerbate an existing situation of very fragile production systems. It is by far the biggest driver of all the complications that will obtain in the production environment of Africa's agriculture. But on top of that, we have all these issues that I've talked about. The lowest fertilizer application in the world. We have by far the least proportion of irrigated land. There's serious binding constraints around infrastructure, for instance, how farmers might just move food from their fields to markets, for instance. So there's serious policy constraints at the same time that we're dealing with other disincentives for production. As we mentioned, Africa has the youngest population, but that population, the median age on the continent is about 19 years of age. A majority of them lack access to land and other components that would determine production. Mechanization is still very low, for instance. The use of technology is just not even there to speak about. There is elements of celebrated successes with mobile cell phone technology, for instance, in many applications, but the penetration of these is not to a degree that would actually start to make a dent on Africa's crop production and food security. You talked about trade barriers, for instance. Africa's import bill, according to the Brookings Institution, is estimated about $43 billion in 2019. So we still get food from outside the continent in huge amounts, and the amount of dollars that we spend in that would be better invested on the continent. But again, the investment climate isn't ready. So I think even with the Africa Free Trade Continental Area, these are great aspirations to have. But I guess the question that we have to keep asking is, what's the connectivity on the continent? It is by far more expensive to travel. Say, even I live in Nairobi. I would pay close to $400 for a 1 hour flight to Uganda. That just basically creates many, many serious disincentives. The travel cost in Europe or even in North America, where you live, are way, way lower than the travel costs in Africa on any mode of transportation, whether you talk about rail, road, air, etc. So there's serious connectivity issues, and these speak to what I would call deferred maintenance. Africa has not invested in infrastructure. Africa has not invested in technology. Science around agriculture is still very weak. We still talk about the forgotten crops of Africa, the underutilized crops of Africa, for instance, cassava, millet, sorghum, and all of these things. The technology in breeding and raising the capacity to produce this has not been anything to speak about.
I think, and you raise a really. I've got a lot of things that are just I'm considering in terms of the points that you raised, and certainly, especially when you think of the forgotten agriculture, as you mentioned, those were the kind of the sectors or the areas, like you said, with millet, sorghum, ugali, of course, in East Africa, sort of as the basis of the food culture that's there. that has sustained the continent for centuries, all those traditional crops. And, as with most things, they're not making more land. And so necessarily it's you have to find ways to better use that land, hopefully in a more sustainable manner. And certainly, especially when you're talking about different sort of facets, whether it's water use, whether it's science and technology, whether it's inter-African trade as well. A lot of those areas, of course, can be ramped up because the population is growing, as we mentioned before, and there are also various challenges that are affecting production, the science, the awareness behind agriculture on the continent. So thank you for those points. It brings me to the next point, and this is really to hone in on the subject of this discussion, is that how do you see these issues being addressed in the context of the African Continental Free Trade Agreement?
So I think, like I said, Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement is a great opportunity. And there's many things on the continent. I think the whole question about regional economic communities, for instance, we have the East Africa Community, we have COMESA, for instance, we have ECOWAS, for example. So these regional economic blocks is not a new thing. I think the expansion of this to a continental scale reflects a very admirable scale of ambition by African leaders. But I think the question is, where is the infrastructure that's going to stitch this together? Travel is still very difficult on the continent. As an African, I still have to queue in line for a visa to go to South Africa, for instance. I need a visa, a Tanzanian would need a visa to go to Ethiopia, even when Addis Ababa is the headquarters of the African Union. I need a visa to go to Mozambique. So I think there's still a lot of critical political issues that need to be sorted out to basically create a truly free trade environment on the continent, across borders. When I travel even to Tanzania, the immigration officials still ask me dutifully how many days I'm going to be in Tanzania, and yet I'm East African. That should give me free access into Tanzania, which is a next door neighbor. You can imagine how much more difficult it would be for me to travel to Niger, for instance, or even to Mali or Algeria or even Egypt. So I think we still haven't. And I think part of it is, many people would opine that this is part of the colonial legacy that created a basis of mistrust, and we've not been able to stitch together an economic reality, which is basically what's going to define the future prosperity of the continent. So we've got some work to do. I believe AU can play a huge role, but we just need to understand what the political obstacles are around, once and for all, tearing down these barriers of travel and create a much more fluid space for commerce, for technology and knowledge exchange. And I think to the point of the Continental Free Trade Area, even our academic institutions, universities and research institutions, we collaborate better with the West than within the continent. And as I say, at the heart of this, trade is going to be driven by science and technology. So if Africa is not stitched in a conversation, in exchange and of human capital and in collaborative capacity development, it's going to be very difficult for us to vision that is the free trade environment that we envisage.
I think that, Dr. Kweti, it really, again, there are some excellent points. And I think, the fact that it's, when you look at a piece of kente, you see lots of different colors, you see lots of different angles, you see stories that are woven into them. And to me, that's sort of representative in the way that the African economy, and in this case, agricultural sector, can prosper by bringing those different groups together at different levels, at different angles, to basically weave that stronger fabric. And, in this case, academia is certainly a very important part, but there's a nonprofit sector, or NGOs. There are certainly industry, different sort of elements that could, make those bonds of connection and understanding. And, I think, as you said at the beginning, trust, because in any relationship, the foundations of it are trust and respect. And, it's one thing to have an agreement.
the question of businesses. Now that you talked about NGOs, I think it's still very difficult to set up businesses. I don't know how, there's not even that concept of multinational African corporation. We have multinational everything. It is easier for Google to set up a business in Nairobi than for Aliko Dangote to bring his businesses into Kenya. And there's evidence for that. It's not for lack of trying. The Dangote operation has tried to get into the East African market, and it has been very difficult.
And that's a really important point, because of course he's, being one of the wealthiest men in Africa, he's also one of the great industrialists who has a vision for the continent. And I know that there is certainly, sometimes you take those singular individuals and they bring up the people around them and the businesses up around them, because they become part of the supply chain.
Yeah.
They become part of the economic ecosystem, or agricultural ecosystem in this case. And why would you not encourage those kinds of people to come to your country to support the investment, the economy, the agricultural sector, whatever element you're trying to support? And I agree, part of it too is stronger investment laws. And that's part of the issue as well. That supports not only the country, but of course the investors themselves, because there are different aspects related to finance, property ownership, partnerships, etc., that certainly those kinds of laws would help to reinforce and strengthen at the same time.
Yeah. So I think one point I just want to emphasize is that it is also the nascent, kind of very early stages of development of the African private sector. They don't have an outsized voice, such as private sector and private corporations in North America, for instance. They don't have strong lobbies in government, for instance, because I think at the end of the day, government will not build the infrastructure that stitches the African continent together, let alone even address the food security question, because fertilizer distribution, the supply chains that you talked about at the very beginning, those will only work if the private sector is given the latitude to play. Government, we know, in most cases gets in the way. But what we need here is government to get out of the way and create an enabling environment for entrepreneurs and brave investors to begin to march on the continent and create the business networks that will liberate Africa's production potential.
And I think that's a really sound point, particularly where both sides, in the sense that not only the laws that support entrepreneurialism and investment and the infrastructure necessary to sustain different sectors within the continent, but at the same time ones that respectful of the communities and the people who live in those countries at the same time. Sometimes, unfortunately, with multinationals coming into African countries, they're not always, how would you say, this is an important consideration that needs to be made in terms of any sorts of investments, in terms of the role, the benefits, the impacts on local communities, and the resources that they have and exist upon.
Yeah, I totally agree.
Yeah. Well, I think that, that's really some fascinating points. I think we'll have to sit down and have a coffee in Nairobi sometime. I have two more questions for you. Do you see countries like Canada playing a role in supporting these initiatives in the AfCFTA and others?
I think Canada has, in many respects, positioned itself as a dispassionate broker in international conversations. I think the global partisanship and polarization is something that Canada has navigated very beautifully. And I think right now what we need is strong, credible, independent voices on the global stage who understand the urgency of the moment and basically who can bring a certain coherence at a global level and shepherd in a focused way for a sustained period of time a critical conversation such as food security. I think Canada's leadership in gender equity is an example that we could basically bring to these conversations around food security. Canada has vast resources and many years of technology investments in large-scale agriculture. And I think what Africa now needs, and the point I was trying to make with the earlier commentary on per capita land holdings, is that on 0.2 hectares per capita, smallholder agriculture is not going to move Africa into food security. We need to change land ownership. We need to change how we engage with natural resources, move these things to production at scale, reorganize the rural population, provide the basic infrastructure that encourages urbanization and creation of dense human settlement where you can efficiently provide services to the population in an efficient way. So I think Canada's leadership in this, I think, would be critical. Corralling the G7 conversations, African leaders with a platform through their leverage, I think would be important. But I think what we really need is how do we crowd international and responsible investments on the African continent in just many respects, in terms of building human capital, technology transfer, and I have, we know climate change is a big issue. So climate change adaptation, mitigation, all of these things I think are critical. And Canada's esteem through global affairs, Canada, for instance, and some of the work that IDRC does in supporting smallholder production systems, but also technology transfer, questions around gender equity are critical because, again, Africa's agriculture is largely managed by women. So having a big partner at the table, moving conversations on gender equity, gender inclusivity, I think would be a very critical piece of these discussions.
Excellent points. And I'm glad to see that I know that you work in conjunction with the IDRC, and thank you for your service to Canada and that support as well. It's much appreciated. And, a number of important points. And I think one that you raised it earlier on, which really, I think it's important in the sense that you talked about traditional agricultural products. And I know that as you see globalization and as you see more international trade, sometimes you see countries, continents move away from those traditional products, move away from those traditional sectors. In some cases, that might be because of climate change. In some cases, it might be because of evolving tastes. But at the same time, as we're aware, that form of agriculture, whether it's grains or animal harvesting, livestock management or other sort of aspects, that is what has sustained people for thousands of years. And so this still has a sound basis in terms of the living fabric of those communities and the countries that are there. And I think that, part of it too is not only to the different technologies and the different aspects that are there, but to look at the food systems as they are and maybe to find ways to retrench and perhaps go back to those traditional ingredients or those traditional sort of agricultural products.
I think that's an important point, and that's the point that I made about science. The death of science in Africa's agriculture. And it goes back to the conversation around building, plant and animal genetics expertise on the continent for variety improvement, for instance, creating varieties of crops and animals, domestic animals that would be more suited to a changing climate. So that's the question of technology transfer, but also building indigenous capacity and creating a system and a network of research exchange within the continent. We have a lot to learn from Nigeria and West Africa, for example. We have a lot to learn from South Africa, but we're just not collaborating enough within the region. We have Ethiopia just right next door dealing with the same kinds of problems that Kenya deals with. But there's very little academic research exchange between these countries or among these countries. So I think this is something that we need to figure out, what is the foundational investments that creates a South-South collaboration. Could it be catalyzed initially by North-South that then creates a network of South-South collaborating institutions? So I think in this kind of space is where our developed country partners would basically provide a basis for underwriting the initial investments to catalyze these kinds of networks and partnerships.
And I agree, and especially in the sense that where those platforms, where those opportunities to interact and to share and to build upon the existing knowledge that's there. And I think there's so much opportunity, especially with the digital and other enabling environments that are there. So, Dr. Awiti, I've got one last question for you, and thank you for indulging me for all the previous four. Do you have any final comments that you'd like to make about your organization's contributions to build Africa's agricultural sector? I know that you're involved with AgriCon University, and the AgriCon Development Network does great work across the continent and Eastern, Central Asia, and in South Asia. And do you have any sort of extra insights that you'd like to add?
Yeah, so the AgriCon Development Network, through the AgriCon Foundation, AgriCon University, there's a lot of work in rural communities. We have a lot of work that we've done in the past in early childhood development, maternal child health, nutrition. These are foundational kinds of investment and effort that basically would be critical as you understand. The cost of hunger and malnutrition in Africa is a huge issue. Stunting is a big problem. So the science of early childhood development, some of the work that we do, inextricably linked to the questions of nutrition and maternal health outcomes. So some of the work that we do kind of lays these foundations, and very active in Mozambique, in Madagascar, in Kenya, in Uganda, and Tanzania, and in Mali as well. And we also had some work we were doing in the Aswan area in Egypt. So a lot of these efforts are critical to laying those foundations at the family level, and also critical to supporting women who are the bedrock of African societies and African families.
Dr. Awiti, it's been a pleasure. Asante Sana, thank you very much. It's been a real joy to have you here this morning to discuss the different aspects related to agriculture to the AfCFTA. And I wish you continued success with your work. Thank you very much for joining us this morning.
Thank you, Fergus. It's been a pleasure speaking with you.